Really a privilege to have you with us this evening. Obviously, we've been teaching this series now for a couple of years, and as we sort of build and develop and explore different aspects of the things that trouble our minds, really, and spending the time to step back, perhaps, particularly at the beginning of the year when we often tend to do something by way of reflection. For us, it's been really interesting, the conversations that the series like this has led to, the different interactions that we've had as pastors with members of our Westside community, and then members of other communities that have connected with us throughout this series. If you've been tracking our series that we taught through January of this year, we kind of took a slightly different angle than we'd done last year when we talked about our fears and our anxieties and depressions. And we started to think about stress and burnout and exhaustion. And although these are deeply complex subjects and we don't want to sort of underplay them, the connection between the two, hopefully for those of you that engaged with the series, was pretty obvious, that so many of our anxieties and fears and some of our depressions are connected to the way that we live our lives in the contemporary world. Our stresses, our exhaustions, and our burnouts are actually generating other challenges in our lives. So this evening is an opportunity for us to sort of step away from the cold outside, but also away from the kind of normal format of a Sunday morning, perhaps, and talk in a little bit more depth. So what we've done for this evening's seminar is I'm really pleased to have Jerry back with us, who taught our seminar last year, and Jerry's now been joined with Susan, who is a professor at University of Calgary. So there's some really good input that you have on option this evening. So how we're going to work the evening is like this. Susan's going to come and share a little bit in a moment. She'll then hand over to Jerry. While they are talking, you might find yourself having particular questions that are forming that you'd like to have some feedback on. So I'd encourage you, if you have a sort of question that you'd like Susan or Jerry to speak to, just scribble it down while they're talking. And what we'll do is after they've talked, we'll have a very brief break just to sort of stretch our legs, grab a top up on the coffee if we need one. And then the final section of our evening tonight will be a conversation between myself and Jerry and Susan, which will give us a chance just to sort of maybe feed in some of the questions. I can't promise we'll get to everyone's question depending on how many we get, but we'll try and speak thematically to at least the things that we are dealing with. So I hope you're looking forward to a very exciting and interesting and informative evening. Our heart this evening is not that you leave simply better informed. It's good to be well informed. Data is helpful. Knowledge is good for us. But we also have a heart in a seminar like this that our net result when we go home after the evening is that we think, I actually kind of feel like I know a little bit more what to do in my day-to-day life. I feel like I've been helped with something that I can do, rather than just going home thinking, well, I know more, but I'm still not sure what to do with it. So our aim this evening is to do something practical ultimately, and to help us all in our practical aspects of whatever nature is that you, well, let me say it like this, whatever it is that's brought you out, we hope that we can say something this evening that's helpful to you. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Susan Boon to you. So Susan, it's all yours now. I hand you the clicker of destiny, and please welcome Susan as she comes to take on part one of our seminar this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, David. As David says, I'm a professor at the University of Calgary. I'm a social psychologist there, and I'm just looking through the room here to see how this group of people that I'm speaking to compares with the kinds of people that I usually speak with there. I'd have to say you're a little bit older than my usual class, but I am delighted to be here, actually. I have spoken at Comic-Con in Calgary. Anybody go to Comic-Con? You're not wearing your costume this time. I've spoken at Comic-Con, I've spoken at Beakerhead, I've spoken at the Science Center. I'm going to be there next week to talk about love and your brain. I have never spoken in church, so it's a real honor to be here. Thank you, David, for inviting me. So I'm going to just warn you that David was hoping there's going to be some practical things that you're learning from today's presentations. It's not going to come from me. I am a social psychologist. I do research. I actually study relationships. Jerry's got that, so I'll go quickly. I'll let Jerry handle the how to help yourselves with this. So my goal today is to share a little bit about what social psychology has to tell us about social comparison processes. And I want to start start my presentation by discussing why we compare ourselves to other people. Okay, so if you remember back a couple of weeks ago when David talked about social comparison, he was talking about comparing the size of your house to your neighbor's house, or the size of your car, or maybe the make of your car to your neighbor's car. So why do we do this? I want to talk about a couple of different reasons why. The earliest ideas about why we compare ourselves with others were that we wanted to learn about ourselves, that it had to do with identity formation and understanding who we are and gaining self-knowledge. So that was viewed as the reason that we engage in these sorts of comparison processes. It's considered to be something that we do rather spontaneously, and typically the belief is that we look to people who are similar to us, or rather similar to us, who are similar to us on the dimensions that we're interested in, so that we can get the best information possible about how we compare. So what we're trying to do is evaluate our social standing. If we want to know how tall we are, or what we weigh, or what our IQ is, there are objective standards that we can use to evaluate ourselves along those dimensions. That's not true, or at least it didn't used to be true. I'm going to talk about social media a little bit later on. And I'm wondering, my students and I were talking in the last couple of weeks, we're wondering if those are now providing us with almost objective standards to evaluate ourselves on. But for most social dimensions, determining how well liked you are, how well respected you are, how well you fit in, there isn't a yardstick or a ruler or a scale that you can measure yourself on. So social comparison is particularly likely, or we were particularly likely to engage in social comparison according to social psychology when we don't have those objective standards. So it's about trying to learn where we fit in, what our position is or our relative standing among others. So again, as I was saying before, typically, we try to compare ourselves with people who are relatively similar. If you want to know how good you are as a skier, it doesn't help you a whole lot to compare yourself with an Olympic athlete, with someone who's competing at the Olympic level. You're just too different from them. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't help you to assess your relative standing if you aim that high for your comparison point. At the same time, it doesn't help you to look to your 4-year-old nephew, because you shouldn't expect your 4-year-old nephew to be performing at the same level you are as well. So typically, we will seek comparison persons, comparison points of comparison, comparison reference who are relatively similar to us. But that's not always what we do. Remember I mentioned that these are sometimes spontaneous, these social comparisons? It's almost as if we can't resist it. I think it's becoming even more difficult with social media to resist these kinds of comparisons. When you drive up in your driveway and you see your neighbor's BMW right there in their driveway, you can't avoid seeing that and making that comparison perhaps. But sometimes the comparisons are more deliberate, and we're more selective about who we choose to compare ourselves with. And that's because social comparison serves purposes beyond simply gauging where we stand in order to learn something about ourselves. Sometimes we engage in social comparison to try to bolster our sense of self-worth, to try to feel better about ourselves. We call that self-enhancement. Sometimes we do it because we are trying to protect ourselves from feeling badly about ourselves. So we can engage in what's called downward social comparison. So I'm going to talk first about downward social comparison, and then I'm going to talk about upward social comparison. So when we engage in downward social comparison, our goal, if we are deliberately choosing someone whose position we believe is worse than ours, our goal is typically to feel better about ourselves, to bolster our egos, to enhance our sense of self. As I've got on the slide here, you see I've got, is it ego bolstering or is it threatening though, when we choose these kinds of comparisons? And the reason I have the question mark there is because research shows that it can go either way. It depends. Now I've selected a rather extreme example of a comparison point here, a homeless individual. Hopefully none of us ever feel the need to compare ourselves to someone who's homeless in order to feel better about ourselves. One of the seminal studies in this area looked at women with breast cancer, and it looked to see how they made sense of their situations and how they understood it. And what they found was that even women with fairly serious breast cancer, who were very ill and whose prognoses did not look very well, even they were able to find someone. That's the power of the creative mind that we have, that that brain that God has designed for us, it is amazing in what it can do. So even these women who are not well at all and who may well have been facing death were often able to find someone that they viewed as worse off than themselves. And so by making that comparison, they were able to feel better about their lot in life. So for example, if they were married women, they would compare themselves to single women who are facing cancer alone. And they could say, well, at least I'm not doing this on my own. At least I'm not by myself. I have the support of a husband or a partner. If they were older women, they would look towards younger women and say, well, at least I'm not a younger woman. I've had a good life. I've had plenty of years to be thankful for. And they would feel better about themselves as a result of that. When we can get to the threatening here is if your point of comparison, the person that you're choosing to compare yourself with, if it's easy to imagine that but for the grace of God, there you would be, if they're very similar to you perhaps, and it's easy to imagine how you too could fall down the road or follow down the road that took them in their path to wherever they have ended up, the easier it is to envision yourself going off the rails in a way that would lead you to be where they are at in terms of their status on this dimension, the more threatening it is likely to be. So this could happen if you encountered a situation where the person you're comparing yourself with is very, very similar to you on some dimension. When I went home at Christmas, I learned that friends of ours had lost their 19-year-old son in a it's not called a C train up there, right? It's the, I used to know, I was from Edmonton. Thank you, it's the LRT. He was killed in a tragic LRT accident. And this hit home for me because this is someone that I was an undergraduate student with. And I have a daughter almost the same age. And it was like that was a threatening comparison for me. That was frightening. So whether a downward social comparison boosts our ego or leaves us feeling threatened can depend on the source, that comparison person, who that comparison point is, and how easily we can envision falling into the same sorts of situations that have led that person to their fate. We can also engage in upward social comparison. So I don't know how many of you, is that the dab? Did Arnold Schwarzenegger actually invent that many years ago? Maybe you have at some point wished that you had the body that Arnold Schwarzenegger. Have you seen recent pictures of him? He looks nearly as good now, and he's, I don't know how old. I mean, amazing what this man has done with his body. So maybe what you're going to do is you're going to compare yourself to someone above you. We will often do that when our goal is to inspire ourselves to engage in change, to take action to change ourselves somehow. Now, whether that is inspiring or disheartening seems to hinge on the extent to which we believe we can attain the status that that person has achieved. And one of the variables that social psychologists have come to understand determines whether we're going to feel that status is attainable or not is which version of ourselves we are thinking of at the time that we engage in this upward comparison. So I don't know if I will be saying something that sounds really weird and bizarre to you when I suggest that we have different selves, but social psychologists have determined that is the case. We can think of future selves, we can think of future desired selves, people we would like to be, we can think of future undesired selves, people we very much do not want to be, we can think of past selves, we can think of selves that fall short of ideal selves, and different things like that. So if you are focused on your best you, the you that is putting in all the effort, you're at the gym every day, twice a day, you're running your, I don't know how many kilometers are you running, David, when you're going up your mountains? I follow you on Twitter. Let's not talk about that. Many, many, many kilometers as he's going up those mountains. If you're doing everything, you're trying your absolute best, and if you are focused on that best you, when you engage in this upward comparison, you see, I still don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like, what's up? I'm doing everything. So if you're focused on that, it tends to be disheartening because you realize that your best you doesn't come close to this individual who's your model that you're aspiring to. On the other hand, if you're thinking of your everyday you, the you that sits around in your pajamas and eats corn chips and watches TV, and then you look at Arnold Schwarzenegger and say, yeah, I can do that too. I can do that too. Or I can maybe do that too. I can get off the couch and try to do that. So that would be inspiring. So what I'm trying to say here again is that the choices that we make, sometimes we choose who we compare ourselves to. And those choices that we make can be important because they can have determining impact on whether we're inspired or disheartened, or whether we are feeling better about ourselves, or maybe whether we feel threatened. I'll add, though, and this will become clearer as I continue and move on to talk about social media in just a few moments, that research suggests that over the long haul, it doesn't really matter so much whether we choose upward or downward social comparison. Over the longer haul, it doesn't look like engaging in social comparison too much is a very good thing. It is associated with some negative consequences, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that, and I imagine that Jerry will probably have quite a bit more to say about that. So I want to back up a little bit. I've given you a couple of different reasons why people might engage in social comparison. I've said that theorists believe that it's partly just to learn about who we are, about our identity, to come to understand ourselves and to gain self-knowledge. I've also said that sometimes we engage in social comparison so that we can feel better about ourselves or inspire ourselves, protect ourselves from feeling poorly about ourselves. Why do we care about where we fit in the social groups that we belong to? Why does it matter to us? Well, I'm a relationship scientist. I can't recall if I mentioned that detail or if David mentioned that detail to begin with. I am a social psychologist who studies relationships. And so when this theory that humans have a need to belong first came out in the late 80s, I was all over this. This was like preaching to the choir. What has become apparently and abundantly evident now is that God created us as social beings, and we have a very deep-seated need to belong. Some of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it starts way at the bottom with like making sure you've got shelter and food and things like that. And then you move up, and eventually there's a need to belong, and then you go up all the way to self-actualization. Well, there are relationship scientists who are arguing that this need to belong is as fundamental and as important to human thriving as the needs for food and water and for shelter. So some of us would argue that it doesn't matter if you have food if you don't belong, if you don't satisfy the need to belong. So let me give you some of the reasons why we believe that humans have a deeply seated, deeply rooted need to belong. We celebrate births and engagements and weddings and anniversaries. So we celebrate the beginning and the continuation of relationships. We resist and we protest separation from close others. We mourn and grieve the loss of relationships, whether it's due to death or divorce or separation. There is no society on earth composed entirely of people who choose to live in complete social isolation. There's no society on earth that's composed entirely of hermits, of people who choose to live as hermits. I know that there are various monasteries and places where people will choose to live by themselves for a period of time, but there's no entire society, there's no entire social groups that do that apart from these isolated small groups, religious orders. I'm missing one of my facts that I wanted to mention here. Oh, what is the worst? In Canada and in places that don't practice the death sentence, what is the worst form of punishment that we dole out to or assign to our most hardened criminals? Solitary confinement. Okay, so all of these different points here have been used to argue that God, no, that's not what my fellow psychologists would say, but I'm going to put it in my words, God created us as social beings with a deep need to belong. And if you think back to earlier historical eras, this need to belong wasn't just sort of kind of an academic thing that we feel best if we have long-term, stable, continuing relationships with at least a few people so that we can satisfy that need. In earlier times, if you were banished from your tribe or your clan or from your kin group, your odds of survival were small to nil. So that's how they argue that the need to belong is every bit as fundamental as the needs for food and water. Now, how does this fit in with social comparison? What I'd like to argue is that one of the reasons fundamentally why we care about who we are and where we fit in relation to other people is that it helps us determine whether we need to take action. It helps us to determine when we socially compare, so we find out what our relative social position is on a social variable that otherwise has no objective standards. It helps us to know whether or not we need to take action to remediate situations that might threaten our ability to meet our need to belong. Hopefully that makes some sense. So we've been talking about the need to belong. We've been talking about different reasons why people engage in social comparison. When social comparison theory was first proposed, it was the early 50s. And I have this strong suspicion that the social psychologists of the time, Leon Festinger among them, had no clue. I don't think they could have envisioned in their wildest dreams. Certainly I couldn't. I was born well before social media. I don't think any of us had any clue what the advent of technology, the recent changes in technology were going to do to social interaction and social relationships. So then God invented social media, and things have gone crazy in terms of opportunities for social comparison. Let me give you a few statistics. How many here are on Facebook? I'll just choose that one. How many? Okay, wow, good. Well, 2.2 billion active monthly users on Facebook. If people who used Facebook were their own country, it would be the most highly populated country in the world. That's 22% of the world's population is on Facebook. And I'm sure most of you know that that's just one social media platform. There's a growing number of additional ones. How many of you are on more than one social media platform? Okay, yeah, a lot of you. Apparently, it is almost 7 out of 10 Americans are on Facebook alone, and that number is growing all the time. My understanding as well is that Facebook is kind of for the older crowd. These days, the younger crowd is on Instagram and Snapchat and some of those other things, right? So let's talk about Facebook for a moment. That's where most of the research to date has been done. And there are good reasons to be very concerned about the opportunities that that Facebook use has to encourage social comparison and in negative ways. Another statistic I have for you is that apparently most Facebook users are on Facebook every day. Most 10-year-olds have active social media profiles. So this is something that people do often, and they do regularly, and they start using them young. When you ask people if they think that using Facebook affects their lives, they don't think so. How many of you think advertising affects your life? Okay, we have not too bad agreement with that particular statement. If it didn't affect our lives, it wouldn't be a multi-billion-dollar industry. Most people, if you ask them, they don't think that advertising has a great deal of impact on their lives, and the social psychology of that suggests very strongly otherwise. And the same seems to be true for Facebook and social media use as well. So one real problem with Facebook and other social media is that it tends to promote and encourage and increase social comparison. Now, if I hadn't told you a few moments ago that that doesn't seem to be a very good thing overall, you maybe wouldn't be concerned, but there's a reason why I picked this image here. When we're on our social media platforms, how many of you are posting the real-life Barbie version of yourselves on your social media profile? Not so many of you, right? It's the highlight reel is what we give to people. So if you're comparing yourself with your friends on Facebook, you're likely to get the highlight reel of their lives. You're likely to get the portrayal of themselves that they desire for you to see, the cleaned up version, the redacted version, the edited and carefully coiffured, is that a word? Carefully coiffed version. The version that looks like Instagram over here. There's a recent social media star. I didn't get a chance to watch the actual video, but my student sent it to me today. She just decided she's going to quit because of how much time and effort is involved in looking that good all of the time to be on YouTube and Instagram and all of those kinds of things. So she herself is trying to distance herself from that. So one of the problems, again, with Facebook then is it encourages social comparison. And unfortunately, it's going to be that upward comparison because the people always look so good. They don't report their failures. They don't report their weaknesses. They get the best pictures of themselves up there. And we're looking at the highlight reel. We don't see the real them. So it's not uncommon for people to engage in social media use and to come away feeling discouraged and disheartened, dissatisfied with their bodies, dissatisfied with themselves, believing that other people are happier than they are. And then Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. I'm too old to be on Facebook, but I am on Twitter, which is where I follow David. And they pass it on, right? Retweets and things like that. And you know how many people are following you and how many people you're following. And you've got likes and dislikes. And I forget what my students said now. Wows and greats and wonderfuls and things like that on Facebook. So we can compare ourselves now on, potentially, we could consider these almost objective indicators of our social status. How many friends do you have on Facebook? Years ago, I had a graduate student who at that time, and this is years ago, Facebook was brand new, he said he had, I'm going to say 5,000 friends. That's probably a ridiculously high number. Maybe it was 1,000. In my memory, it's just grown. Apparently, it's more typical to have 300 some odd friends, but he had 1,000 at that time. It would be hard to compare yourself with Eddie because he had thousands of friends. So he looked very, very, very popular. You could compare how many likes you receive, what kind of attention, what kind of comments your posts receive or your photos receive. We're going to be conducting some research in my lab looking at social engagement with media, social media profiles, and the extent to which that influences people's judgments of people, of their social reputation and their social acceptance. Because we think, and the research strongly suggests, that how people respond to and engage with your posts and the information that is on social media about you affects how people feel. So these days, it's not good enough to get likes. If you don't get any response, that is damning. People feel horrible. And apparently Facebook causes conflict in relationships when partners aren't quick enough to like each other's posts. Imagine that. And you're not just comparing yourself with the people on Facebook or with your romantic partner. Maybe you're comparing them with their former partners or their possible future partners. The potential for comparison with other people is virtually endless. There is also some research strongly suggesting that there may be some addictive properties to social media use, that it lights up the same areas of the brain that are associated with the use of cocaine and things like that, the reward center in the brain. If you don't think that these software companies and social media companies aren't designing your phones and your apps and your social media platforms to keep you engaged and immersed in their product, you're not suspicious enough. Okay? So basically, I just want to suggest that there are potential problems with social media. I don't want to be a Luddite here and suggest that it's always a bad thing to be on Facebook, but it does tend to promote social comparison, and the research really is starting to voice some concerns about that. That use of social comparison can lead to depression. There are studies suggesting that that may be the case. So I have quickly for you here 3 take-home messages from what I've said so far today. I am overstating the case here a little bit with this one. I think comparing yourself with others is something that we do naturally. I don't know that we can completely avoid it. I don't know that God means for us to completely avoid it, but I'll leave the theology to David. But our brains are certainly wired in such a way that I think it would be hard and difficult not to engage this behavior. So what I'd like to actually rewrite that take-home message and say that I think it's normal and natural behavior, but we need to be a little careful about it too. We are also social beings, and my second take-home message is that social comparison processes may be, I'm going to dare to say, a useful tool in helping us to gauge whether we need to take action to make sure that we can continue to meet our needs to belong. Where it can go awry is like in the cases where that comparison is inappropriate because all you're seeing are the best sides of people, people that don't really exist. That's what they look on social media platforms or on the versions of themselves that they're allowing you to see, but that's not who they really are. They're probably no happier than you are. They just appear that way on the social media platform and in other comparison contexts. And lastly, with respect to the discussion of social media, I would suggest that social media may exacerbate tendencies to engage in social comparison, and like I've just been saying, make it because of those highly idealized presentations that people post on their social media, make it harder for us to feel good about ourselves when we engage in comparisons on social media. So that's all I've got to say. I'm happy to invite Jerry up here to help you understand what you might be able to do about some of these stresses and strains and anxieties and so forth that social comparison might lead to. Thank you.
Hi. You should have some notes and a handout that I'm going to refer to in a minute, but I want to just give you a 30-second exercise that isn't about comparison, but hopefully will get you thinking. I want you to look to the person, if you're in this group, to two people to the right and identify who that person is. And if you can't figure it out, just make sure you get a partner and that you don't get left out. I want you to think of one of four things and decide which one you are most afraid of. Ready? Spiders, closed-in spaces like tunnels or caves or elevators, public speaking, or leaving your iPhone home for the day. So I want you to go. I want you to say, hi, my name is Jerry Fitch, and the one that I'm the most afraid of is all of them, or number two, this one, because. You got 30 seconds. Do it. So that should have been a good hit of comparison as well as anxiety, but thank you for participating. My first piece of vulnerability is to tell you that I'm not afraid of any of those. But I have something that I call LOTA, L-O-A-T-A, which is late onset airplane turbulence anxiety. And so I struggle with that, and I work hard at it, and I try to put some of these things into play, and it usually doesn't work that well when the turbulence starts, but it's pretty good after it ends. So let me say that the wisdom of Solomon tells us that there's nothing new under the sun, and anxiety is nothing new. I think that each generation, it just attaches itself to new global or political or environmental or technical things, and attaches itself to personal and relationship challenges that we go through, our expectations and the plans and the dreams that we have. But before I get too far, I want to say that while tonight is a seminar that's aimed at learning and thinking and some basic strategies to address the complex nature of anxiety, it still remains that at times we need to seek help beyond this kind of teaching, when the symptoms are significantly impacting our lives and persist over time despite our best efforts. I've spoken a lot, and I think never have I made the invitation to say to you that one of the important strategies you should think about when you struggle with something significantly is counseling. And I think that's because of my fear of marketing myself. But I'm not marketing myself, I'm marketing the idea that if we need others, we need to talk to others, we need to talk to safe others, we need to share secrets with others, we need to learn skills from others who we don't have to sit down with the next day at our breakfast table. Counseling is a very helpful thing beyond what you can learn in seminars like this because it's one-on-one based. It looks at the serious and significant issues and assessments of what's going on in your life. It teaches assessment skills, it encourages, it keeps accountability. It does a lot of great things that I think too many of us are afraid to engage in. So that's my plug for the importance of looking at that side of things. The brain's a complex organ of the body that we continue to study and learn about. Patterns of distorted thinking can have a genetic or trauma-based or physical base that benefit from clinical interventions. Sometimes when I work with clients who are really struggling, I have to say to them, you know, it doesn't have to be this hard, because they've lived with it long enough and they're familiar enough with it to think, this is normal, or I'm not going to get better. The point is, you don't win awards for tolerating or toughing out anxiety symptoms. And the constant chatter I hear, I'm not sure I believe it, is that I'm afraid if I get some help or if I take medication, there's a stigma attached to it. And often I'll ask in sort of try to tease out what that's about, and it's some story of somebody's grandmother who took meds and went off the deep end and didn't get better, and someone over here who, ended up in a bad experience. So I think we get afraid of the stigma, and sometimes that's the stigma we actually are putting on other people when they tell us stories about what they've tried. Research continues to confirm that the best clinical approaches for assessing and healing mental health, anxiety, depression symptoms still remain sound. 3 pillars: a combination of medication and counseling, like learning things like assertiveness skills, and consistent aerobic exercise. That's the 3. They haven't changed. The research has not changed. If you can't afford any of those, exercise. It still has a consistent base of research to support how helpful it is. But sadly, people with anxiety more than anyone else tend to resist all 3, and especially medication or talking to a stranger. And partly this has to do with their fear of not being articulate, not explaining themselves well, being judged negatively by professionals, or more likely of somehow feeling a loss of control. So while initially scary or overwhelming, visiting a doctor that you trust or talking to a therapist may be a helpful and safe place to start sorting out challenges. I'm also really pleased that Bob Osborne has now taken on a role to provide spiritual direction and counsel for us. Take advantage of it. And the church and Calgary-based family docs have developed a list of clinical counselors they know and trust that they can refer you to as well. It should be a team-based approach when something has been chronic like this. So many of us, whether we know it or not, are convinced that worrying is a helpful strategy that keeps us from harm and those we love from harm. We don't actually have anxiety unless we first worry. And even though we may want to be less anxious, we can't actually imagine living without it. It's very familiar to us, and it seems to give us some measure of control. And then eventually we become comfortable with anxiety and tolerate it as an acceptable and normal part of our lives and our language. I was so stressed out. I kind of had a panic attack. I really lost it. I'm a control freak. We use that kind of language and familiarize ourselves. In fact, anxiety is a learned behavior. Sometimes it comes as a consequence of trauma, and sometimes it's in response to present suffering and fear of the unknown. But whatever the reasons are, when we're challenged, afraid, insecure, or confused, we tend to default into worry and anxiety. And that's how we begin to develop habits of thinking and behaving that continue to keep them a big part of our lives. And for some of us, despite our best efforts, we have seasons of being so anxious and so not present to ourselves and others that we can actually experience ourselves as ghosts that appear to be solid but are really very fragile. This is often a familiar but an exhausting, lonely, and scary place to be. There is so much I could unpack for you tonight in terms of strategies, but I had to pick a few. And so in my time, I've chosen a few general critical things that I think will be practical for you. Let me start by emphasizing that David has laid out the overarching critical, spiritual, and biblical scriptural truths which are the foundation of a strong identity. That identity begins with recognizing and embracing your inherent value in Christ. Whether you know who you are, when you know who you are, and know in the depths of your being that you are always seen by and unconditionally loved and cherished by Christ, you can remember that you are not a ghost, no matter what level of anxiety you have. Susan did some great thinking for us on identity. A huge foundation of how you live within the challenges that you face is knowing who you are and having a critical identity that no one can take away from you. So faith remains one of your greatest foundational resources to manage anxiety and stress. It's not just for others, it's not earned, it's not for later, it's not for you. Sorry, it is for you. It's free, and it's for now. It's what gives you your value of self. And to connect to David's concept, it's the rock of Jacob that you lay your head on, and what anchors you against the ladder of comparison that you're attempting to climb. As David so well explained, God is at the bottom of the ladder. So here are my strategies. I've given you a handout, so if you want to follow sort of where I am in this, I'm just going to go through some practical things. Now, Susan did already a pretty good job, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. And I have a handout because it's pretty self-explanatory, and it's the best stuff I've seen laid out recently. But here it is. Set and model strict daily and weekly rhythms where you and your loved one's digital devices are intentionally set aside, out of sight. Let me explain why this is important. Technology is an amazing gift. It connects us with friends and families, sort of. It helps us navigate roads and cities and provides with news and entertainment so we're not bored. It's brought blessings in education, opportunities in medicine, and it's helped spread the gospel throughout the earth. But the commercial promoting the iPhone 7 promised to get you in and out and back to life quicker. We now know definitively from published research that our devices are actually constantly and seriously distracting us from life, and they're becoming better and better at it. My personal belief, and those of my colleagues as well as educators, is that chronic media overstimulation and exposure leads to emotional overload, chronic stress, and it likely feeds into our present epidemic levels of anxiety across generations. And that's not even the stuff that connects to the comparison stuff. Technology connection has changed our brains at all ages in response to being in a habitual state of partial attention. I work a lot with ADD kids and adults, and the research is actually showing now that people who actually have focus and attention and distraction issues are now beginning to converge and intersect with people who don't have ADD as a result of ongoing connections and partial attention with high media usage. In the past years, studies show that our attention span has decreased from 12 seconds to 8 seconds, and that our memory capacity has declined. When you don't remember things, you can become anxious. Actually, former executives of social media, I just read an article last night, are now admitting that their apps and alerts are designed with more and more sophistication to connect to and stimulate the dopamine levels in our brains. The goal of service providers to make money is to have our faces to those screens more length of time and more often in a day. That's how they sell advertisements, and then that's how it takes us into the social comparison trap as well. A man named Jeffrey Hammerbacher, an early social media pioneer, said in a Business Week magazine interview that the best minds of our generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. That's kind of sad. So we've developed habits and dependency in how we need our devices that keep us on them throughout the day. And if a habit is not resisted, soon it becomes, and for many, probably addictive. I've said the word probably. I actually believe a lot more than that, but that's just my view. A consequence of addiction is anxiety. And why? Because when we're having to have limits to our access of anything or unwanted restrictions, we become anxious. But more concerning in the work that I do, and some of it was referred to by Susan, is that whether we like it or not, the dark side of technology promotes an acceptance of pseudo face-to-face communication and relationships which create face-to-face relationship avoidance and isolation. We think the generations below us, for sure, that have never not known the internet, think that what they're connected to and people and their relationships with 1,000 people are real relationships. They are not. They are pseudo relationships. And they create more and more avoidance and isolation. Social media apps show the exaggerated positive presentations of others, which often negatively impacts our mood as well as our self-esteem. The handout I gave you, which you have, is a really helpful set of specific individual and family strategies to help you intentionally choose, experiment with, and stay accountable as you change how you interface with technology. So that's the strategy side. It's sitting there in that second 2-page idea. There are strategies to talk about as a family, and there are strategies to think about yourself alone. If any of you here are parents, if you really want to change what's going on in your family, it has to start with you and the decisions that you make and that you model for your kids and that you keep accountable. There are some interesting things in it, how you don't necessarily need to only take your phone to use as a camera. You don't necessarily need to use your phone as your alarm clock in the morning. One of the problems is we don't turn off our screens, and so we lose problems with sleep, which creates problems with anxiety and depression. Or first thing in the morning, when we use it for our alarm clock, and then we start to see things that are going on, we start to add anxiety and stress to our day of all the things that happen before we've even paid attention to our self-care. So it's important to think about the rhythms of what you use and to make some very specific decisions about how you want to change that. The one that I like the best, that I put in bold, is never use a device when engaged in any in-person conversation. That includes being driven in a car as a passenger. Because even if unintentioned, checking a device in front of someone sends them a degrading message about the value of the person you're with, as well as their time. I could not agree with this more. But don't expect others, including your kids, to do what you're not prepared to do. So read the handout, reread the handout, have some conversations with people that you team up with, and then talk about how you want to change that and be accountable to it. So this brings me to my second point. Pursue, prioritize, and deliberately be in one-on-one real-time relationships with a lot of people, a lot more. Go back to it. Be old-fashioned. Mentor and be part of being in community. Being here tonight versus watching this online has a different impact. You're with other people, you smile at other people, you laugh with other people, you make fun of other people, you do things that create a sense of being connected and belonging in little ways or in big ways. That's why church, that's why the teen group that I spoke to a couple weeks ago is there, so that they can belong, so that they can be safe, so that they can make stupid mistakes and embarrassing moments and figure out what to do with it. One of the things I said to them is, I hope every one of you gets broken up with in your relationships as a teen at some point. Not break up with somebody, get broken up with, so you can understand what rejection feels like. You can realize that you can actually recover from it, and maybe pick somebody better next time to date. It's very important for us to experience difficult things, difficult conversations, conflict, fierce conversations. Intimate and strong relationships are critical to prevent loneliness and help us affirm that we matter to others and have value. It's not just about comparison. It's being in real-time relationships, being in a situation where maybe you are compared, but you talk about it and you figure it out and you say, hey, that's not me. Important relationships require courage and loyalty and skills to develop and sustain. And intimacy with others is created by spending quality time empathizing with, and relying on others over time. I really think we have a crisis with empathy in monitoring and mentoring kids. If you're not in real time, you are not experiencing empathy, either in voice or in nonverbal communication. And if nonverbal communication remains about 80% of how we communicate to people, that could be a problem if you're not in face-to-face communications. That's how we develop healthy attachments, when we know and are actually known, not pseudo-known, and when we trust and commit to other people over time. Community is messy, but it's life-giving. So, join and plan and commit to consistently get to know and support other people in real-time community, and hang in there with it. Show up to yourself and others by preparing to be present with them physically and mentally and emotionally and often. And for those of you who have difficulty with commitment, make the commitment and then diligently protect that time. If you don't, your lack of commitment will be contagious and could model permission for everyone else to not show up. The obvious corollary to this is don't overcommit to things or people, or that creates stress as well. My third point, don't avoid. This really significantly relates to anxiety. Learn to tolerate discomfort. Don't avoid. When you avoid doing things or being with others out of fear or perceived fatigue that you have, your world gets smaller and you are less competent and known to yourself and to others. And also recognize that procrastination, I'll do it later, is actually a form of anxiety. Our initial awareness of fatigue is often emotion-based, not necessarily physical. We can think and say to ourselves and others that we're exhausted, but it's less physical than emotional. And emotional fatigue can cause us to give in to avoidance and then justify not doing something that needed to be done or be with somebody who needed us. Okay, I'm a big one. Family values. I often work with families and parents and say, well, what values do you want to pass on to your children? What values did you grow up with that you value and want to preserve? And what values didn't you that you want to make sure you did? That's setting goals about what you believe in and what gives you a sense of self. And here's the big one. Don't lie. Don't lie to yourself, don't lie to others, and don't lie to God. When you lie to yourself, you sacrifice the future for minimizing distress in the present moment. Did you catch that? You give up, because of the fear of distress in the present moment, a sacrifice for what could be in the future. We often lie to avoid consequences that cause distress to us or those we're protecting. And in parenting, this is one of the biggest troubles that we have in the generation now, is that helicopter parent or the rescue parent who really has difficulty with anxiety of seeing their children in some kind of distress or rejected situation. And so they don't allow it to happen. And the child doesn't learn that they can handle stuff, that they can be more autonomous, that they can handle and repair and fix and be resilient when bad stuff happens, including bullying. When you lie and then you start to believe your lies, you lose discernment to know or value truth. Then it's easy to blur moral and ethical lines and minimize or justify your behavior over time. And gradually you defer to an end justifies the means philosophy of survival. And don't lie to others, either directly, accidentally, or by omission. If you always tell the truth, you do not have to worry about remembering when or what you said or to whom you lied. You ever done that with a little kid who isn't really good at it yet? And you start digging a little bit and they can't remember what they said and they get kind of confused and then they start crying and they realize, yep, I think you've got me, I did lie. Lies lead to a conscious or subconscious increase in anxiety. And when you realize you've lied, repair quickly. That's your strategy. Take responsibility, accept the consequences, and this will decrease your anxiety. Lies of omission. They are the most dangerous and far more damaging than people think. Deliberately not paying attention to things is a form of lying. And when you avoid or ignore saying truthful words and doing truthful actions, you can slowly lose the ability to discern truth from lies because you just avoid. Finally, don't lie to God. There's no point. He knows our hearts and he knows our minds. Remember Adam and Eve in the garden that David talked about? Adam lied and naively hid from God, as if you can. When Adam knowingly disobeyed God's command, the immediate consequence was that he began rationalizing, defending, blaming others, minimizing, and then emotionally and physically distancing himself from God. Hiding causes increased anxiety. It's a lot of work to keep hiding in the dark or wearing a disguise hoping God won't recognize you. Along the way, you can lose your sense of self because you're alone and you forget the best parts of who you are because there aren't other people to witness and tell stories and be with you in that. Hiding from the self and avoiding God is lonely, and it increases your anxiety. 5, rehearse, remember, and retell yourself the truth. So if you can't lie, know what the truth is, and keep telling yourself what that is, and retell it. The mind controls the thoughts. Then your thoughts produce your self-talk and determine whether it's hopeful or scary, and whether you like yourself or loathe yourself. This slide, I'm not going to go into it in big, but this is stuff we do in counseling and therapy, is to help people understand that it's really the thinking that comes before the feelings, that comes before the behavior. Most of us, when we're anxious, only feel. We're overwhelmed, we're scared, we're lonely, we're all sorts of things. But feelings don't occur in a vacuum. They come from what we thought in a nanosecond, or core beliefs we were told, or lies we absorbed from other people, or trauma. But what we think affects what we tell ourselves, and what we tell ourselves affects how we feel, whether we're sad or lonely or scared or angry. And then that affects how we behave, whether we avoid other people, whether become passive aggressive, whether become aggressive, or whether we become assertive, which is a good thing. Now, it's not always linear. Sometimes when you're anxious and the stuff is going on so hard in what's going on with you, that sometimes it's a good thing to just move right into behavior, go and do a run or an exercise, or talk to somebody who's hopeful and not negative. And sometimes it takes the spinning of your thinking and your emotion down just because you distract yourself into something that's actually relatively helpful. Self-talk is what you tell yourself every minute of every day. It's often influenced by things like your competence, your humility, your insecurity, possibly past trauma, and sometimes temperament. I work with a lot of people that have that temperament that's really indecisive and analytical, and they're always going over and over and over a decision in their heads, which makes them anxious, which makes them keep deciding, which keeps them stuck. Unfortunately, there are people that have that temperament. They're highly creative. They're the Beethovens of the world. They do some amazing things, but they really struggle at times with just getting stuck in their loops of overthinking stuff. Okay, I want you to just take a moment. This won't hurt that bad, but I want you to close your eyes, and I'm going to give you some familiar voices that you think and tell yourself and hear in your head that are untruths, because they directly affect your identity and your level of fear and anxiety. When I say these things, some of them you're going, yeah, no, that doesn't bother me. Oh yeah, that one's one I'm pretty familiar with. So just close your eyes for a second. I'm going to fire through about 10 of them and see which ones fit you. I'm not well liked. I'm not that smart. I'm not that pretty. I don't have any real friends. I'm always left out. No one really cares about me. Bad stuff always seems to happen to me. I'm always alone, and I probably always will be. I'm afraid of being left out. I'm afraid of looking stupid. I'm ugly. I'm too fat, too skinny, too scrawny, clumsy, boring. Pretty soon, something worse is going to happen. I won't have a good time, so why do I bother even going? Okay, you can open your eyes. So, this is about learning to tell yourself the truth, not lies. When you know what lies are, you have more of a chance of being more aware of what the truth is. Never argue with gossip or fear or lies. You don't even have to emotionally believe the truth for it to be true. The truth has power in the saying. So, when you catch yourself saying that in your head, because sometimes you're really stressed out, it's like, what did I just tell myself? I just told myself a lie. The lie was this. Okay, so how do you handle that when you become more aware of it? You don't really have to be that creative. The truth stands for itself. It's not complicated to figure out because mostly the truth is the opposite of the lie you told yourself. You always start a counteractive, hopeful truth statement with, you just told yourself you're not that smart. That's not true. And then tell yourself the truth, which is the opposite of what you just told yourself. So now shut your eyes. I'm going to tell you some truths that are the opposite of what I just threw at you. I have people who like me. I'm smart enough. I'm loved. I'm normal. I'm pretty enough. I'm strong enough. I have friends. I belong. People care about me. Stuff happens. It's not always bad, even if it feels like it right now. I'm not alone. I can choose to participate so I'm not left out. I will enjoy myself if I just show up and join in. I am enough. Just trying to give you a sense that lies and truth are not that tricky to figure out. You just have to know what you've told yourself. Say to yourself, you know what, that's not true. The truth is this. This is who I am. I particularly like what priest and author Henry Nouwen has to say on this topic of the voices in our heads and the voice of God. He says, many voices ask for our attention. There's a voice that says, prove that you're a good person. Another voice said, you better be ashamed of yourself. There's also a voice that says, nobody really cares about you. And one that says, be sure to become a successful, popular, and powerful person. But underneath all these, often very noisy voices, is a still small voice that says, you are my beloved. My favor rests on you. That's the voice we most need to hear. But to hear that voice requires special effort. It requires solitude, silence, and a strong determination to listen. I'm going to blow by point number 6. It could take a while to unpack, but I think the point is stay in and focus on the present moment. Catch yourself playing that, living in the past and thinking about and regretting all the things that you did wrong or someone else did to you. And then flipping over here into future what if thinking. What if I lose my job? What if my child doesn't make the volleyball team? Both of these ways of thinking, living here or continually looking back over here, increase anxiety. You need to stay in the present moment. And people go, well, what's that about? It's basically just saying, what are you thinking? What's going on right now? What do you need to do right now? It's pretty simple to just ask yourself a few questions. Where are you? What's going on? What do you need to do? Focus on the present moment. You can do that sometimes when your mind and anxiety is going all over the place by reading stuff. Go back to like the real thing. Actually, there is an app on this, Jesus Calling. It's been around for a long time. What I particularly like about this one is it speaks to anxiety in most of the 1-paragraph, 2-paragraph devotionals. Sometimes when I'm really having a hard time, I pull it up, I look at it and go, okay, that's good to remind myself of. You can play relaxing music. You can take a walk. You can talk to somebody. You can call a friend or call someone you'd like to be your friend. Do something creative and distracting to present to your present task. Make a recipe. Have a face-to-face interaction with someone. How to do that when you're anxious? Just ask them a curious question. Not how are you, but just, hey, what's going on? See, what's up? Nothing. What's up with you? Have another question and link that question to another question. Learn to be curious. It's not that hard. Sometimes when I do assessment or assertiveness training with people, I go, okay, you be you. You be the person you're worried about. I'll be you, and you give me all the what ifs that could happen. and I'll give you answers for them, and we'll role play, skills, things you could say. And then, to keep yourself worrying from the future, tell yourself this: whatever happens, I will handle it, and if I don't know what to do, I'll get some help. I'll handle it. If I don't know what to do when I get there, I'll get some help. That's about staying in the present moment instead of trying to figure out what you're going to do if something happens, which 90% doesn't happen. Other stuff does. Okay, I like this one a lot. Suffering is a part of life. It's going to happen to us and others we love or care about in our lifetime. For many of us, it already has. Because we are finite beings living in an infinite universe that God creating, engaging in life and relationships and growing older always involves disappointment, loss, and suffering for all of us. Expecting, tolerating, and adapting to unwanted change or loss and the accompanied suffering that goes with it entails will need to be endured and managed throughout our lives. Suffering is inevitable, but it doesn't have to be scary. That's why we need community. That's why we need connections to people who can be empathetic and support us through it. Suffering builds perseverance. Perseverance builds character. And learning resilience is hard, but life-giving and brings hopeful healing over time. I'm becoming more and more aware that when bad stuff happens and we get help and we work things out, healing does happen over time. Time heals. There's some truth to that statement if you hang in there and work it through. Get help and support when you're going through grief, because grief not observed will increase yours and other people's anxiety, and they'll avoid you. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. On this topic, clients will often say to me, when I say yes, I get grumpy. And when I say no, I feel guilty. I just want to say a little bit about our Canadian culture of politeness and our need to say sorry as an introduction to everything we do and say. We excuse our lack of clarity because apparently we don't want to say something that will hurt someone's feelings. So we often start our yes and no behaviors and language with, sorry, I can't come. I really wish I could. Then we follow that statement by using more sugar-coated words and excuses or giving these unclear messages of maybe that leave the other person confused. We never told them yes, we never told them no. We just avoided it because we didn't want to hurt their feelings, which really mean eventually they could hurt our feelings back. Be un-Canadian on this. Don't apologize when you say no. Instead, say with gentleness, no thank you, I want more time for my family. Or, thank you for asking. I hope it's a lovely time. Or I hope you're successful at your fundraiser. Or that you're able to find others to help you. Be very clear and deliberate with your words and use a neutral tone. Don't lie and say you wish you could be there, or your spouse won't let you, or you have to be somewhere else, especially when that's not the case. Lying creates anxiety, and other people pick up that anxiety, and anxiety becomes contagious. Own your choice and tolerate the related guilt, anxiety, because it will pass and it'll quickly be more replaced with relief. I love Matthew 5:37. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else beyond these is of evil. I don't think of that as being intense evil thinking. I just think it is when you don't be clear with people, they interpret stuff that you're not saying. They're trying to figure it out. They feel rejected, but they really don't know if they are rejected. And it just gets really confusing. And it's not fair to them, and it's not fair to you. So let your yes be yes and your no be no. It doesn't say in this scripture, when you say no, apologize. Or you should try to say yes as often as possible so that people will like you and God will be pleased by your sacrifice. The truth is, God really doesn't care about your sacrifice. He cares about your heart. So know what your role is and diligently protect it by saying no to yourself, which sometimes involves impulse control and dealing with a bit of anxiety. And say no to others when they have different expectations, needs, or demands on you from whatever relationship or environment. And you can't say no or yes until you first get some relevant facts and take some time to reflect. Try not to get caught in the pressure or pace of the moment. That's how advertising works. Decide what you think, what you feel, and what you want for yourself in the relationship. Know who you are, know what you value, know what your role is, and what it isn't. Then it will be much easier to know how and when to assert yourself and set clear boundaries like David talked about. Set boundaries with others and set boundaries with yourself. Just say yes or no, and less is better. Role-playing and practicing is a lot of what we do in therapy, so that you can learn to continue to repeat the same thing over and over again. When people take you down rabbit trails, bring them back to, no thanks, thanks for asking, gotta go, or just say it over and over again. And that's sometimes tricky when you're worried people will continually try to persuade you or endlessly negotiate with you like your teenagers, or they'll just plain pull rank. My last point, cultivate solitude. Spend time alone. If you're not very good at this, don't pick a whole day. You'll drive yourself nuts. 10 minutes at a time is a good thing. It's really important because we don't like being alone with our thoughts. They scare us. They annoy us. They overwhelm us. So you have to learn in small ways how to have solitude, maybe by something you read or some music or going for a walk. Henry Nouwen is the master of speaking on this, so I'm going to let him finish. He says, solitude is the garden for our hearts which yearn for love. It's the place where our aloneness can bear fruit. It's the home for our restless bodies and our anxious minds. Solitude, whether it's connected with a physical space or not, is essential for our spiritual lives. It's not an easy place to be since we are so insecure and fearful that we are easily distracted by whatever promises immediate satisfaction. Solitude is not immediately satisfying because in solitude we meet our demons, our addictions, our feelings of lust and anger, and our immense need for recognition and approval. But if we do not run away, we will meet there also the one who says, do not be afraid, I am with you, and I will guide you through the valley of darkness. So that's my 10.
Well, I think I want to just say thank you to Susan and Jerry for just some great insights. And yeah, let's just say thank you to them. I want to start by telling a slightly personal story that I hope doesn't embarrass Jerry, right? And this is just, Susan and I are going to talk for a minute. You just have to look in on this. So you talked about upward social comparison and downward social comparison. The first time I ever met Jerry for a proper sort of just she and I conversation, we were sat in Phil and Sebastian's at Chinook, right? And this relates to something you said earlier on. So she started asking me about a few things, and we got talking about the fact that I run, right? And Jerry was really cruel to me in this conversation because she let me yabber on, that's a good Scottish word there, about running and so on and forth. And all that Jerry said to me was, yeah, I used to run a little bit. And so then I Googled Jerry. Jerry has her own Wikipedia page. Like, how cool is that? And discovered that
I'm not on Wikipedia.
I know, but someone else has created this. And discovered that Jerry was in the Canadian Olympic team as a runner. And so I then replayed. I remember saying to my wife, like, I went on and on and on about running, and realized I'm sat in the presence of like a god, right? And so I learned lots about this. I immediately scratched Jerry off from someone that I was going to compare myself next to, and I chose to compare myself to my 4-year-old nephew because I can just about outrun him. So talk to me a little bit, and both of you, and really, I'm trying to tease Susan into a little bit of pastoral work. She said to me earlier, no, I'll just do theory, but I'm going to tease a little bit out of you. And Jerry, I'd love you to speak to this. Yeah, I'd love you to speak to this as well. It struck me as both of you were talking, because I'm fascinated, and I know a lot of people here tonight are, about when we start to think about the stresses that are generated by how we compare ourselves to others, and then what that does for our anxieties. And so many of us would, I think if we were honest, say, yes, we're aware of that. I'd love to talk a little bit about the sort of destructive aspects of that. So you'll see that in one sense socially. You'll see that with people that you meet. And I think there's more to perhaps unpack in that about what this is doing to us. So not just, so we, I could feel when we were sat listening to you, people going, yeah, we all do this social comparison thing. And it's kind of easy at one level to go, oh yeah, we all do it, and we know that it's maybe not unhealthy. But what are you seeing in your own fields in terms of how deeply that's damaging us, both the sort of stress of just trying to keep up versus just the inward kind of the way we speak down to ourselves and have these, and destroying our self-perception. Anybody would like to unpack that a little bit more, or speak about that somewhat?
Go for it. If I don't have a deer in the headlight look right now, I ought to. Ay, ay, ay.
Really, what was your question?
What I'm trying to scratch at, and sorry, yeah, what I'm trying to scratch at.
I got lost at the Olympic thing.
Yeah, sorry. It's the only chance I get to leave you behind.
I'll keep score.
Yeah. No, I want to help us not walk away from a conversation like this, and this is maybe my pastoral heart coming through. I want to help us walk away from a conversation like that and not just go, oh, that was interesting. I probably shouldn't so compare myself to my neighbor's BMW. Maybe I shouldn't look so much on Facebook. So one of the things that's come through in conversations I've had with both of you, and then the research that I did for this series, is the destructive aspect of this. Of how the stress that is generated by this, and what this actually. You made a throwaway comment, which I think is a really deep one, that we know this is connected to some depressions and things like that. So just if you wanted to unpack that a little bit more, I think we would appreciate that.
You're still hoping I'm going to go first? Ay, ay, ay. I don't know. How's that for an answer?
I still don't understand the question.
Okay.
But we can just talk about stuff that we think's interesting. Yeah.
I don't know if I can unpack that, but I think that, I guess one of the things something that came to my mind as you were thinking about this is, it's very easy when you compare yourself to other people who appear to be doing better to forget all that we do have and how incredibly and deeply blessed we are to live in this great country, and to have free healthcare and free education, and it's a democracy. And I'm just looking around the world and I'm thinking of all the things that are going on in other places that are frightening and disturbing and terrible injustices, and we can get all wrapped up in a knot because someone's got a nicer car than we do, or a bigger house, or they've got they appear happier. And I guess I'm wondering how deeply dissatisfied many people are on the inside, even though they are portraying themselves in their daily lives as though they are happy and they've got things pulled together, and they really don't. And I don't think I unpacked a single thing there, but you are asking me to expand my brain in ways that it hasn't been expanded in a long time.
So
ask me about revenge. I can tell you anything you want to know about revenge.
Oh, no, I have a question about that later on.
Okay, excellent.
How do you intend to get revenge on me for my first question?
I'm thinking about that right now.
So let me unpack it, and
help me out here, please.
Speaking to both of you, and I really am happy if you both jump in. And so I was thinking, it struck me, your social comparison conversation. So I see, on the way home from work, I see a homeless person. And I also see my neighbor's got a new BMW, right? So, and I can see that quite easily. That's not a difficult homeward journey. And so I'm now dealing with two aspects of social comparison, and I am an anxiety sufferer, right? So I now thinking, goodness me, if I don't work so hard, I will maybe end up like that homeless person, right? And what if I did this, and goodness, I had an argument with my boss, and what if my boss fires me? So I need to stop having arguments with my boss. So that's good. And then, oh my goodness, look at that car. Their car's much better than my car. my car's probably going to fall apart soon. So then I make a judgment call at some point. Instead of staying home on Saturday to spend time with my family, I'm going to try and impress my boss by going to work. No one's asked me to do this, but I'm now living in this. And I imagine this is I know pastorally, there's a lot of people being driven by, well, I've got to do this, because if I don't, what might happen? And so we get caught in these cycles. So I was really curious about that sense of how this comparison leads to stress and then starts to make the sort of judgment stuff that you were talking about, Jerry, where now I'm actually disconnecting myself from the really important stuff in life in order to make that happen. So if I was sat on your couch right now, like, how would you advise someone to, like, how do you avoid that? Because these feel like very real fears, like, what does my boss think, and is he requiring me, and so we're sending emails late at night, we're checking our phone and doing work before we've even got out of bed in the morning. Like, my guess would be most Calgarians would relate to, at some point, the invasion of their working life into their family life, and the stress is the thing that stops them allowing that to happen. Does that make sense?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
So do you want to speak to that?
We could spend a lot of time talking about why, and I think we know why we have
Yes,
this
yeah,
insecurity.
no, absolutely.
But I think the idea is, if that keeps happening to you, what do you want to do differently? And so comparison is about, where do I want to be? Where do I think I was? Where do I, how could I get there? Instead of saying, where am I now? What am I supposed to be doing? What's my response to this homeless person? Why am I feeling this anxiousness? What did I just tell myself about my adequacy? Don't go too far into it, but, like, what's the truth? Will this really matter in 10 minutes when I get home to my kids? Will this matter in 10 years from now when I'm in a different job? At some point, you have to, I think, stay enough in the context of not seeing so much value in figuring it all out in a comparison way, and just saying, who am I? What do I need to be doing now? What matters to me? And really, the answer is relationships matter. I mean, you've all heard that story of, on your deathbed, do you think you're going to say, I wished I'd worked more? You will look at your legacy of who mattered to you, who's here for you, who created the memories for you, what influence did you have on other people's lives and values. That's what's going to matter. And you just don't want to get stuck in that sort of round and round loop thing. Sometimes you just actually have to say, stop. Just stop. So it's not that easy, but that's the solution.
But it strikes me as quite fascinating, and I felt aspects of this in both of your talks, and I wonder if others felt the same, that actually some of these principles are actually very, very simple. Like, some of your observations, like there's not a lot of us are looking at Facebook and actually, if we really think about it, thinking, this is really helping my life. Like intuitively, so you mentioned the research now suggests this isn't making us happier. We all knew that. Like we didn't actually need research to prove that to us. Like I'd love to have seen that research presented, in some sort of academic forum. After all of this work, we've found out that Facebook makes us miserable. And I can imagine everybody going, yeah, we kind of knew that, and it's helpful now to know it for sure. But it struck me in that sense that there's, social comparison is a form of anxiety at some level, isn't it? It's we don't necessarily, we think of them in these sort of different streams. And so I thought there was some beautiful, like, for me, I'm always listening to the hopeful aspects of our conversations that we might have. And I found, like, you made a comment, Jerry, and again, jump in and unpack it further if you want to. Although I thought you did a fantastic work on that this can be unlearned, So these simple things like stopping and learning what to value, so social comparison can be unlearned at some level, that we don't need to, we can realize what's speaking into our lives. We can realize where we're gaining our value from, that we've actually chosen. And I'm really happy for you guys to correct me if I'm not representing you well, but we've chosen arbitrary values to compare ourselves against. We've chosen Facebook. We've chosen our friends on Facebook, and these are going to be our comparisons. And so, like, what I heard in some of the things you were saying when I connected that with you were saying, Susan, was, and then I can unlearn that. I can actually I can actually close down my Facebook account, and I wouldn't die. That's. And I know a lot of people follow me on Facebook, so know that I try and keep a relatively active social profile, but, like, this is not actually hugely significant in our lives. So pushing that sort of on, because I do want to talk about this because I think it's quite scary actually. Like and you use the same language that I've used, Susan. Like I don't want to be a Luddite. I'm terrified of people going, he just doesn't like technology, you know. Mm-hmm. But as a parent, as a pastor, like the data that we're now seeing regarding social media, both in terms of what it does to social comparison, how it creates anxiety, is actually quite terrifying, you know. And so, you know, we've got parents and grandparents in the room tonight. You know, let's talk a little bit more about that then, as to how do we guide, you know, like if we were trying to have a conversation with our younger people and our, you know, and listen, let's be honest, it's not just young people, all adults, you know, how would we, I mean, in one sense, I imagine this question's a very obvious answer, but give us some help on how you would sit down and talk through in your family group, like how do we improve our social media? Because I imagine if you sat down with the average teenager and said, let's just all kill our social media accounts, that sounds like a form of suicide, I would imagine, to the average 15-year-old. Mm-hmm. So totally turning it off probably won't work. How do we guide, how do we parent, how do we grandparent that through something like this?
I'm not the counselor or the clinician, but I'm thinking that a common refrain that seems to be, that I'm hearing through the questions and through what Jerry was saying, and as I'm considering the discussions I've had with my students about this over the past couple of weeks, I think at some point we have to start talking about what we value in life and what we're going to attach value to, and maybe I think that there are false values, and that the insanity with Facebook and social media and being connected 24 hours a day, I think that that's leading us astray, leading us to false values. And maybe if we have some of those hard conversations with ourselves and with our families and our students and our friends and so forth about what's truly of value, that might, I mean, again, I'm not trained in counseling, so I don't know where to go with this answer, but I'm thinking that that's part of what's missing from this, is it's elevating values that have no actual value. Mm-hmm. That's what I have for you right now.
Yeah, no, and that's a really fascinating, elevating values that have no actual value. You know, that's. I mean, you and I were having a conversation a little while ago about this sense of, we talked about this need to stop, and how. You and I had a private conversation, I think 2-3 weeks ago, didn't we, about this fear, and so many of the times in sort of our conversations, both as pastor, as a therapist, this fear of missing out, which social media hugely adds to, like there's stuff going on and I'm not part of it. So, you know, like when we say, if we were to sit down with a parent or with a child or a grandchild or a friend and say, maybe this is destroying your life at some level, you're becoming really paranoid about this. I have a few friends on social media that I am now the other side of the world from, that clearly have some like real challenges in terms of their appearance, and social media is clearly causing them problems on this. And you see them discussing this on social media, but in a slightly unhealthy way. And so this part of me wants to say to them, well, why don't we just turn off social media then? Because this isn't helping you. But then you get this, but this is how I keep in touch with that. This is how I keep in touch with the other person. So this fear of missing out that's created, which I think is a form of stress, and I think it's a form of anxiety, and it's not just our kids, it's us with our ski trips, and it's us with our promotions and all that. How do you manage that? Like, I thought you in our private conversation, you talked beautifully about what happens when you actually are willing to slow down. And do you want to unpack that a little bit?
I can pack some part of it, I think. As far as thinking about being a grandparent or being a parent, let's start with parents. You start parenting kids when they're very young. So if you have a value that you want to instill, which is the value of spending one-on-one time and listening and be empathic, etc., you start when they're really young. And you start with what's developmentally appropriate with that age. You tell them stories about your own lives. You show them pictures of their lives. You tell them stories about other people that they know. They love stories. You read them stories that have those values in them that become connected to their sense of understanding how life works. You also, even when they're young, set boundaries for things that are important. I mean, how many of you, when you were kids, your parents said, look, you can't date till you're 18, You can't go on a one-on-one date. It has to be with 2 people, and this is how far you can go, and this is how we want you to deal with this. And if I ever catch you with cigarettes, then they gave you that stuff. And some part of you went, yeah, whatever. Like, yeah, no, they're my friend's cigarettes. You went through all of that. But they were conversations that were about learning discernment, as opposed to it's all about punishment or consequences. You need to let natural and logical consequences happen, but you have to think about what your values are and start from a young age. And another thing that I think that's a mistake that parents make, and this is my personal opinion seeing it in therapy, is they say, well, look, my kid is just constantly on the iPad. He takes it to bed with him. He sneaks it into the bathroom. It's this, it's this, it's this. And I can't get him to come for dinner and I can't get him to go to bed because he says just 10 more minutes. So then I give him 10 more minutes, and then he's still upset with me. And I say to him, look, I gave you 10 more minutes. Like, aren't I a nice mom? You are rewarding addiction with addiction. It makes no sense. It's always going to be difficult for a person to transition off of television or iPads or whatever it is. So why do you postpone it? If you want them to have 15 minutes, don't make it a reward. If you do this, I'll give you more time on the computer. You're rewarding the wrong thing. Instead of saying, you get 10 minutes after you've done your homework, and when 10 minutes is done, I shut down the Wi-Fi. Like, use very strong boundaries because you are behaviorally training yourself and your child, as opposed to having these negotiations. And believe me, there are strong-willed kids there that can negotiate you under the table. Don't let them intimidate you. Make your decisions. You can see my passion about this, but I think we get stuck in I'm pretty sure I can still be their best friend and their parent. You can't. It doesn't matter whether they're 10 or 20. If your kids are in the basement, living there, not getting a job, and playing games, and you don't want them to do that, you got to figure out some behavior training that gives them natural and logical consequences. I think you just have to be very strict about, if it's a learned behavior, how do you do things that give them unlearned behavior? Yeah. And you're part of that right from the get-go.
And I thought, and I don't really have, this is more just an observation, I thought it was a really important point that you made, this is my guilt speaking, that we have to lead that, in our families, in our homes. So, it's really difficult to say to your child, you can't have any more screen time from behind your iPad, and from while texting on your phone or so on. And so this sense of, if I can sound like a pastor for a second, there's really fascinating theology that weaves its way through the Bible about presence. Presence, not presents.
The gift of your presence. Yeah.
One of those fascinating little texts that maybe we can unpack more at some point in another seminar is when God calls Moses up the mountain to give him the 10 Commandments, and it's never translated. And I sometimes wonder if it's because English translators don't understand it. But God says to Moses in the Hebrew text, he says, "Come up on the mountain and be here." Which is really fascinating. And most of the translations say something like, just come up the mountain. They drop this. And it's really fascinating that even there God says to Moses, like, you have to come up the mountain, and then you have to be here, you have to be present, you have to be fully present. And I think there's so much, about that. And then this then, and this is me just trying to attach some theology to what we've been talking about tonight. And I think I'm increasingly seeing how psychology and theology are really close together. Then you think about Jesus, like, how does God save the world? Doesn't send a message, it doesn't, he's present, he comes, it's incarnate, So there's something really for us to unpack about presence in all of that, about how, I think one of the most hopeful things the church sometimes does is take communion together, because you have to be in the room to do that. You have to be with people. You have to share something. And I think that's really profound for us. So let me just change gear for just a moment. A couple of questions that people have sent up. Here's a thought, and probably a lot of us would ask questions about this, and the questions framed resulting in a language of anxiety, but I would also want to speak to stress and depression and these sort of things. But if you are anxious as an adult, right, how do you help an anxious child or an anxious friend, or and now I can relate to a question like that, particularly because your great fear as anybody that struggles with anxiety or depression is that you're passing that on, you know. So would either of you like to speak to a question like that? So, you know, is that, the answer might be, well, an anxious parent helps an anxious child in exactly the same way, or are there some particular navigational sort of processes through that?
You want to speak to it?
I think this is in your wheelhouse.
I think
hoping it is.
I'm seeing a
I think
pattern
the
here,
reality is I think the reality is that anger begets anger in families, anxiety begets anxiety in families. And so you really do have to take a pretty close look at am I anxious in certain situations for certain periods of time, or is this sort of my default position? And if it is, it's really important for you to be very deliberate about A, being honest, but B, dealing with it in very specific situations where you can tell stories, but you can say, here's what I've learned, here's what I think. What's it like for you? Especially if you have a child that you can see that they're anxious. Don't label them, but be really curious. You know, what scares you? What do you think about when this happens? Don't put your anxiety on them by asking too many questions and hovering too much and keeping them from things that could be anxious for them. When they're anxious, like, wow, that's a bummer. So how'd you handle that? Like, it's important to have those conversations that aren't about fluff and niceness and let's avoid it and let's not talk about it, or they'll grow out of it. You'll see it if it's real, and you'll know if you're actually adding to it. And if you are, you need to think some very specific strategies of how to keep it out.
And don't reinforce it.
Don't reinforce it, yeah.
Yeah, no,
And that's important even with parents with kids who have school anxiety. They don't want to go, right?
Yeah.
Well, what are you most worried about? Well, my daughter, we were standing in line for grade 1, and she had a sister who's older, who seemed much smarter and much more with it. Of course, she was 3 years older. And so she goes in the line in grade 2 and says, I want to go home. And I said, like, what's going on? Well, I just want to go home. I just don't feel well. And so unpack. She says, I don't think I can handle grade 1. I'm not smart enough. And I said, well, the good news is you only have to be smart enough for today, and the teacher will tell you what you need to do for tomorrow, right? Stay in the present moment. It's kind of scary, but you'll figure it out, and you'll have what you need, and if you don't, I'll help you with it. But they go to this place of, I'm not ready for this because I'm comparing myself to somebody who's bigger and smarter and all of that.
And I dare say that many of us, I won't ask for a show of hands, but many of us probably approach many days at work like that.
I don't want to go to work today.
Like,
yeah.
Like, I don't think I'm smart enough for this job today.
Yeah.
And,
what if they find out I really don't know what I'm doing?
Yes.
And to tell a story about, being an Olympic athlete. One of my favorite movies, if you haven't seen it, it's well back, 10 years, is called Wimbledon. And this is a story of a British guy. It's a love story and all of that. But the beauty of this is that, you're probably watching him and like, look at this guy, he's going to win, or isn't he great? And he gives you the self-talk of what's going on in his head, and it's hilarious. It is like, what am I doing here? People are going to laugh at me. What was I thinking? I can't win this. Like, this is embarrassing. He just went on, and it's hilarious because you go, that is so me. Okay, so now let's fast forward to me, and you give me this label, and I say, I was walking into many a stadium for national teams and going, when are they going to call my name and say, Jerry Fitch, you don't belong here. What were you thinking? You didn't make this. Get out. That's what went on in my head. Not always, fortunately. I would focus on something, but that's what goes on your head. Somebody's going to find out I'm a fake. It's just anxiety.
About the only thing that can actually contribute here is this is common. They call it the imposter syndrome. And it's something that many people experience. So there's my brilliant insight. It's very, very common.
Thank you so much for coming, Susan.
I'm glad I was available.
No, well, I'm going to reckon that there's something. I want to ask you something about when I was sat listening to.
I hope I have an answer.
No, I think you will, right? Because so I found myself.
I don't think I belong
you notice
here.
how I'm stacking the chips here. Like so, I love to. You mentioned something. Don't lie, right? One of my favorite theologians said you can teach Christian ethics in one sentence. Don't lie, right? Really. Because everything else that we do wrong in life comes from that, right? And so if you could stop lying, you would probably cut out all of your problems, right? But of course, and you expanded it beautifully to, but let's look at who you can lie to, right? And of course, lies then create stress and anxiety,
Yes.
because lies create, I think it was Einstein that said, tell the truth, it's easier to remember,
Yes.
right? And so lies naturally create stress and anxiety. So then I was thinking about that in, the anxiety and the way that affects our relationships, right? And be that family, work, and everything like that. And so now, you see where I'm going with this, see? So the kind of darker side of our relationships, how we try and structure and shape our relationships around sometimes like lies. I think we don't, you said it well, but I think it's so important to recircle back around this. Talk about some of the destruction of that, when we start lying and then we start acting on that, and when relationships start to go difficult as a result of the things that are causing us stress and anxiety and why we don't tell the truth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm experiencing the imposter syndrome in a big way. Oh, yeah. There's a huge literature on deception in relationships and the damage that can cause. And one thought that's come to mind when you've asked that question is, if when you lie to others, you start to believe that they're lying to you. And or you disparage them because, well, if they're gullible enough to have believed that, what kind of a weak person would actually believe what I just told them there? So deception is I liked how you pointed out that there's different kinds of ways of deceiving yourself and other people. It's not just when you falsify information. It's when you omit details and you just don't say anything to begin with. It can be when you, what is the name for that? When you downplay something. I know it's got a real technical name, but I can't remember it at the moment. Or exaggerate. There's different forms that
exaggeration be one.
Different forms that it takes, and it's not a healthy thing between people of any kind of relationship. Having said that, I think you also said that you're often trying to help people or avoid hurting them when you lie. But when they find out later on, they tend to be doubly hurt. To find out that you didn't trust them enough to tell them the truth to begin with, that you tried to protect them, and you've only made matters worse when it finally comes true. It comes out to be the truth. Did that make any sense? Maybe I made some sense if I'm very lucky.
Absolutely. And I think that's, like, to me, it just struck me when I was listening to both of you and thinking about the sort of conversation, that sense of how the downplaying, that that's not really that important. It's easier just to lie. And then the ways in which we can lie, just avoiding something, just stepping away from something, or just allowing something to continue that's unhealthy or something like that. And again, I think a lot of us would, and again, I'm not looking for confession from people, but, a lot of us would say, goodness, that's so easy to do in our relationships, that because potentially there's an argument out there, potentially there's a rejection, the yes and the no thing. You think Canada's bad, wait till you get to Britain. We will actually do the things that we lie about just to get out of saying no to someone. No, I can't come round. I'm going on vacation. Okay, I better find a vacation to go on now.
Actually, that is true. I sometimes work with people who have avoidant personality disorder. It's pretty significant, and it comes from trauma and a number of things. And they will do that very thing because they want to get out of a social situation where they've been invited. They will actually do bizarre things like drive out of town and lock their doors and make it look like they're not there. So that they're being honest about the fact, and it's painful because it is about their fear of loss of control, or an inability, just a need to avoid in order to control life, and they will do that.
Yeah. And so I just thought it was really just a great point for us to take and just internalize and think about and watch ourselves on. But what damage are we doing to ourselves and our relationships by?
Well, have you ever been in a situation, and sometimes it's related to specific things, but where you can take I don't know, let's say it's a 9-year-old kid, but it can happen with elders as well, and you have 5 people who witnessed this person say something, and you say, well, you said this. No, I didn't. Yeah, well, no, I heard you say it. No, I didn't say that. Well, he saw you say that, and then and you think, how can 5 of us tell you that we heard this and witnessed it, and you still say, I didn't? And then we just don't get it. But some people over time believe their own lies because they've said them enough that becomes their new story, their new truth. and they don't remember what the lie was.
Yeah.
And so now it becomes something they can defend to the death, even though it's a lie. It's quite fascinating, but it does mean it's kind of like that Gollum thing, right? You kind of turn into the lies you believe at times, and you lose yourself.
It's strange as well when you're saying that. It strikes me that it works the other way around as well. That when we have a truth and we're in the presence of lies. So I remember watching a documentary some years back where they put people in a room. They tried it with children, they tried it with adults, and found it to be broadly the same. They put people in a room and they asked them very simple questions, and they had to write down the answers to the simple questions. And then, but some of the people were actors, and they purposely wrote down wrong answers. And they never, no one was ever required to show their answers, but they were asked to by a show of hands what they'd answered. And if enough people in the room raised their hands to say that they had said the wrong answer, the people that had the right answer would admit to having written the wrong answer just to make sure that they didn't feel like the odd one out.
Well, it's peer pressure, right?
That's conformity.
Conformity.
This I can talk about.
All right.
Finally.
Over to you.
So talk about it then. Sorry, Susan.
I can tell you, Solomon
forgive
Ash,
my sarcasm.
1953. Yeah, I mean, that's the pressure to conform and to go along with the majority opinion is tremendous.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that dissenter to help you cling to the truth, our reality can get entirely warped. And sometimes people are well aware of the fact that they know what the real answer is, and they know that it's not what this other person says it is, but they're going to go along with it. Just they don't want to rock the boat, and they know that they're changing, that they're not saying the truth. But some people come to internalize the lie. It's like, well, I must have been wrong. You know, I thought I had the right answer, but I must be wrong because everyone else is saying this. So it can be pernicious. Sometimes you think with conformity, when you know the truth and you don't go along with it because everyone else is saying something else, sometimes we can still inside ourselves realize, okay, I'm just going along because I'm weak-willed and don't have what it takes to stand up and say what's really true and go along with what I know to be right and correct. But sometimes it can cause us to change our behavior and change our attitudes and actually come to believe the lie.
Right, and that's the one of the main causes of emotional abuse, and being in that kind of environment where you're being told something, and if you don't, there are serious consequences, or you're just continued to be emotionally lied to until you believe those lies, and then you don't know the difference, and then you need to belong, and then you need to be safe, and then you need to go along to get along, and you have this cycle of how you get lured into believing the lie and not knowing because you need to be safe.
Yeah.
And kids, that happens to kids a lot. Yeah.
Well, I think we have been in the company of two brilliant, funny, and intelligent people this evening. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us. Let's just say thank you to Jerry and Susan once again. I really appreciate you coming and taking the time. It's